Silver chains bit into raw wrists. A man threw his whole weight against them and the beam above him groaned. Blood ran down his arms. He fell back gasping. He tried again, harder, and the iron ring in the wall held firm. The effort left him folded on the dirt floor, too weak to lift his head. Then the door creaked. A small shape stood in the gray light. Not a guard, not a soldier. A boy, barely 3, clutching a crust of bread in one fist and a cup of water in the other. The child walked straight to the starving stranger and knelt down beside him in the dirt. And the stranger, who had once been called Rurik Vane, the Alpha King, wept. Why would a scullery maid's toddler risk everything for a chained man the whole keep pretended not to see? Stay with me on this one. Nobody in Thornwatch Keep ever called Elsa Brant by her name. To the cooks she was girl. To the guards she was nothing at all. Just a pair of hands that made the floors shine and then vanished before anyone had to look at her. And that suited her fine. In a keep ruled by wolves, being invisible was the closest thing a poor woman could get to being safe. She was up before the sun every morning. She hauled water. She scrubbed the great hall on her knees until her fingers cracked. She never once lifted her eyes to the high table where the new master sat, because the new master was the reason she kept her head down. His name was Havard Crane, and 8 months back he had taken the throne of the clan by force. Nobody said out loud how he'd done it. That was the first thing you learned in Thornwatch. There were things you did not say and places you did not go, and if you were smart, you never asked why. She'd seen what happened to people who asked. A groom had once wondered aloud over supper where the old king's guards had gone. He was gone himself by morning. Nobody mentioned him again. That was how it worked here now. People didn't disappear with screaming and blood. They just weren't there the next day, and everyone learned to look at the empty place and feel nothing. Elsa had gotten very good at feeling nothing. She thought of it as a skill, like scrubbing, like carrying water without spilling a drop. Elsa was smart. She had one reason to be, and his name was Tobin. Tobin was 3 years old, and he was everything. His father had died in the fever 2 winters back, before the boy could even walk, and since then it had just been the 2 of them in a cold little room off the kitchen. Elsa worked so that Tobin could eat. She swallowed insults so that Tobin could sleep somewhere warm. When a guard shoved her against a wall for being slow, she took it, because a woman with no husband and no family had nothing between her child and the cold but her own 2 hands. So she kept those hands busy, and she kept her mouth shut, and she taught her son to do the same. But you cannot teach a 3-year-old to be afraid of the right things. That was the trouble. Tobin was curious about everything. He wanted to know why the fire cracked and where the birds slept and what was behind every door. He talked to everyone, the mean cook and the drunk guard and the old dog by the hearth, as if the world had never once given him a reason not to. Elsa loved that about him, and it terrified her in equal measure. Every day she watched him march up to some hard-faced soldier and ask his name, and every day she held her breath until it was over. And there was one door in that keep that everybody stayed away from. The old woodshed out past the kitchen garden down in the pines where the frost never quite melted. For months now it had been guarded. Not always. Just now and then a soldier posted there, then gone, then back. Food went in some mornings, not much. A heel of bread. A bowl thrown down like you'd throw it to a dog. The servants had noticed. Of course they had. Servants notice everything and say nothing. There was somebody in that shed. Somebody Havard wanted kept alive, but only barely and only in secret. And every soul in Thornwatch had decided all on their own that whoever it was safer not to know. Elsa had decided that too. She'd walked past the woodshed 100 times with her eyes on the ground. Believe me, she wanted no part of it. But one frost-bright morning, she turned around and her son was gone. She'd set him down by the garden wall with a wooden spoon while she pulled the last of the winter carrots. She looked up, and the spoon was there in the dirt, and Tobin was not. Her heart stopped. She dropped the carrots and ran, calling his name low, not daring to shout, because shouting brought guards and guards brought questions. She checked the kitchen, the chicken run, the path to the well, nothing. And then she saw it, the woodshed door standing open a crack and no guard in sight. Elsa's whole body went cold because she already knew. Her boy, her curious, fearless little boy, had found the one place in the world she'd spent months teaching herself not to look. She crossed that frozen ground faster than she'd ever moved in her life, pushed the door open and stepped inside. What she saw stopped her dead. There was a man chained to the far wall, or what was left of a man. He was huge, or he had been. You could see it in the frame of him even now, the wide shoulders, the long arms roped with muscle gone thin. But he was starved down to bone and shadow. His beard was matted. His wrists were torn raw where silver cuffs held him. Silver. Only wolves used silver on their own kind, because silver was the one thing that could hold a shifter down and keep him from healing, keep him from turning, keep him weak. And kneeling right beside this terrible chained stranger, holding a cup of water to his cracked lips, was Tobin. "Tobin," Elsa breathed. "Tobin, come here now." But the boy didn't come. He just looked up at her with those big, serious eyes and said, "He's thirsty, Mama. Nobody gived him water." The man lifted his head, and Elsa's knees nearly went out from under her because she knew that face. Under the filth and the beard and the ruin of him, she knew it. Everyone in the clan knew it. It had been carved over the gates. It had been stamped on the coins. It was the face of the true Alpha King, Rurik Vane, the rightful ruler of Thornwatch, the one they'd all been told was dead. The man who was supposed to be dead looked at her, then at her son, and in a voice barely a whisper, cracked from thirst, he said, "The boy has more courage than every grown man in this keep." Elsa stood frozen. Everything in her screamed to grab Tobin and run and forget she'd ever seen this, to go back to being invisible. Because if Havard Crane was keeping the true king alive in secret, chained in silver in a woodshed, then knowing about it was a death sentence. Not just for her, for Tobin, but her son was still holding that cup, still tipping the last drops of water into a dying man's mouth. And the man was drinking like it was the only kindness he'd been shown in months, because it was. And Elsa Brandt, invisible scullery maid, mother of one, had to decide right there on that frozen dirt floor which kind of woman she was going to be. She should have run. She knew she should have. Instead, she found herself crossing the floor and kneeling down next to her son. Up close it was worse. She could see the fever in the king's eyes, the way his breath rattled. He didn't have long. Days, maybe less. "Your Grace," she whispered, and the old title felt strange and dangerous in her mouth. "They told us you were dead." Rurik gave a broken sound that might once have been a laugh. "Havard needed me dead in the eyes of the pack, but a dead king's body can be dug up and mourned. A dead king can become a martyr." His head sagged. "So he keeps me here instead, rotting, forgotten. He wants the pack to forget my scent, my name, everything, until nobody will follow me even if I walked out those gates. And then when I'm nothing, he'll finish it." "Why not just kill you now?" It came out before she could stop it. "Because the old law still lives in their blood," Rurik said. "An alpha who murders the true king outright breaks the sacred bond of the pack. The others would turn on him. So he starves me slow and calls it fate. He's patient. He's clever." His eyes found hers. "And you should go. Take your son and go and forget my face, or he'll do worse to you than he's doing to me." That was the moment. Any sensible woman would have taken that gift and run. But Tobin looked up at his mother and said, so simply it broke her heart, "Can we bring him more bread, Mama? He's still hungry." And something in Elsa that had been folded up small and frightened for 2 long years cracked open. She thought about all the times she'd looked away. All the times she'd stepped over a beaten man in the yard because stopping was dangerous. All the time she told herself that surviving was enough, that a mother's only job was to keep her child fed and quiet and alive. And she looked at her boy, who did not know how to look away, who had never once learned that the world wanted him to, and she understood that she had been teaching him the wrong lesson all along. She made her choice. "We'll bring him bread," she said quietly, "and we'll bring him more than that." She came back that night, and the night after. She stole bread and dried meat and a wedge of hard cheese, hiding them in her apron, and she brought clean water and a rag to clean his wounds. She learned the guard's habits when he came and when he drank himself stupid and left the shed alone. There was a rhythm to fear, she discovered, once you stopped running from it and started studying it. The guard drank after the evening meal. By the third hour past dark, he was slumped against the shed's outer wall, snoring, and the pines swallowed every sound. That was her window. She fed the king by hand in the dark, a little more each time, and slowly she watched the life come back into him. The first night he could barely swallow. By the third he could hold the cup himself. By the fifth his voice had steadied and he told her small things, the names of the pines, a joke his father had once told him, and she found herself almost laughing in that terrible place. And through it all Tobin came with her, patient and quiet, and the great chained king would smile at the boy in a way he never smiled at anything else. She asked him once in the dark whether he was afraid. He was quiet a long time. "Not of dying," he said at last. "I made my peace with that months ago. What frightened me was the forgetting. Lying here, feeling myself go blank day by day until I wasn't a king or even a man, just a thing in a shed that ate when it was fed. That's what he wanted, to hollow me out before he ever touched me." He looked at her son sleeping in the corner. "Your boy stopped that. Every night he says my name. You have no idea what that's worth." But the silver was the problem. As long as it held him, he couldn't heal, couldn't shift, couldn't fight. Food kept him alive. Only freedom could save him. And Elsa knew, the more nights she came, that feeding him was one crime and freeing him was another entirely. Feeding a man could be called pity. Breaking his chains was treason, and treason in Thornwatch had only one price. On the seventh night she brought the file. She'd taken it from the smithy, a thin iron file for shaping horseshoes, slipping it into her apron while the smith's back was turned. She knelt in the dark and set it to the silver cuff and began to work. It was slow. It was loud. Every scrape sounded like a scream in that silent shed. Her hands shook so badly she had to stop and press them flat against her knees. Twice she froze at a sound outside, some small animal in the brush, and waited, heart hammering, sure the guard was waking. Rurik whispered to her to breathe, to steady, to work in time with the wind so the gusts covered the sound of the metal, and Tobin slept curled in a corner in a nest of old sacking. Hour after hour she filed, until the metal grew hot and thin, and then, near dawn, with a sharp crack, the first cuff gave. Rurik pulled his hand free and stared at it like he'd forgotten he had won. Then he took the file himself and went at the other one, and with his strength returning it went faster, and before the sun was fully up, both cuffs lay broken in the dirt. He was free. He stood, swaying, one hand on the wall. For the first time she saw the full height of him. Even waisted down, he filled the little shed. He looked at the broken silver, then at the sleeping boy, then at her, and he said, "I will not forget this. Whatever comes, I will not forget what you and your son did for me." Then he slipped out the back of the shed, into the pines, and was gone into the gray morning mist. Elsa gathered up her sleeping son and buried the broken chains under the woodpile and hid the file in her apron, and she walked back to her cold little room with her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole keep must hear it. She lay Tobin down. She lay down beside him, and she waited. Nothing happened. The morning bell rang like always. The cooks shouted like always. Elsa rose and scrubbed the great hall on her knees, and no alarm came, and no soldiers, and no Havard. She had done the most dangerous thing of her life, and the world had simply gone on. The king was gone. He was miles away by now, safe in the deep woods. It was done. She let out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. Tobin ate his porridge and banged his spoon. She almost smiled. For the first time in months, she let herself believe that they had gotten away with it, that the danger had passed over them like a storm that never broke, and that she and her boy were safe. The horn split the morning air like an axe. Long, low, and rising, the war horn of Thornwatch, a sound Elsa had heard exactly once before, on the day Havard took the throne. She dropped her scrub brush. Boots thundered across the courtyard. Dogs began to bark, then to howl, and under it all rose a sound that turned her blood to ice, the deep, furious howl of a wolf pack on a hunt. They'd found the empty shed, and in that instant everything changed. This was not about one starving man anymore. This was not even about the king. Elsa understood, kneeling there in the wet on the great hall floor, that the moment those broken cuffs were found, the entire machinery of the keep had turned. Havard would tear Thornwatch apart stone by stone to learn who had done this. Every servant would be questioned, every hand examined for foul blisters. She looked down at her own palms, at the raw red wheals across them, and felt the ground drop away beneath her. And when he found who it was, there would be no mercy, no invisibility, no keeping her head down. It was no longer a question of whether she could hide. It was a question of whether her son would live to see another winter. The door of the great hall banged open. A soldier filled it. "Nobody leaves the keep," he barked. "The master's orders, every servant to the courtyard." "Now." Elsa rose slowly, wiped her hands, and went to find Tobin, because whatever happened next, she would not be parted from her boy. And if you've come this far with me, if your heart's pounding a little the way hers was, do me one small favor and hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want to hear how this ends. Now let's get back to it. The courtyard was packed with every servant in Thornwatch, shivering in rows, and at the top of the steps stood Havard Crane. He was younger than Rurik, sleek and unscarred, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He held one of the broken silver cuffs in his hand, turning it in the light so everyone could see the bright fresh cut in the metal. "Someone," he said, and his soft voice carried across the whole silent yard, "has stolen something of mine." He came down the steps slowly. "A hound got loose, a dangerous one, sick, half-mad, and one of you set it free." He walked the rows, and as he walked he studied hands. He lifted a chin here, turned a wrist there, and every servant he passed went rigid as stone. "Now, I am a reasonable master. Give me the name, and only that one pays. Stay silent, and I will begin taking children from their mothers until someone finds their tongue. I'll start with the youngest." A ripple of terror went through the crowd. Elsa's arms tightened around Tobin. She could give herself up. She could step forward right now and take the punishment and pray it ended with her. But she knew Havard. It would not end with her. He'd take Tobin too, to punish her, to make an example, because a man like that understood that the cruelest thing you could do to a mother was not to hurt her, but to hurt her child in front of her. There was no version of stepping forward that saved her son. Havard reached the end of a row. He crouched down in front of a weeping woman clutching a baby, and he reached out a hand for the child. "Stop." It came from the back of the crowd, an old man's voice. The keep's stablemaster, gray and bent, a man who'd served 3 kings. He shuffled forward on stiff legs. "Leave the babes alone, Crane." He dropped the title. Everyone heard it. "You want to know who freed the true king? Then you've already told us the answer to a bigger question. You've told us he's alive. You told us all he was dead. You lied to the whole pack." Havard rose slowly, his face darkening. "Old man, you've lived a long life. Don't spend the end of it foolishly. Rurik Vane is alive. the old man said, louder now, turning to the crowd. Havard chained our king in a shed and starved him like a dog. That's not a master. That's a thief and a coward, and the old blood in every one of you knows it. Havard moved fast, faster than the eye could follow, half-shifted, claws out, and he struck the old man down with one blow. The stable master hit the stones and did not move. A woman screamed. And the crowd, which had stood frozen for 8 months, began very quietly to growl. That was when the gates burst open, not with soldiers, with wolves. A dozen of them, gray and lean, streaming into the courtyard, and at their head one enormous black wolf with eyes like green fire. Elsa knew those eyes. She'd knelt beside them in the dark for 7 nights. Rurik had not run. He had gone into the woods to gather the ones still loyal to him, the hunters and outcasts who'd never bent the knee to Havard, and he had come back. In the center of the courtyard, the black wolf rose up and became a man again. Rurik Vane, still thin, still scarred, but standing tall, his voice rolling out across the yard like thunder. Havard Crane, you wanted the pack to forget me, look at them. Do they look like they've forgotten? Havard's soldiers drew their blades, but they didn't advance, because all around them the servants had gone still in a new way, and the loyal wolves ringed the yard, and the old law was waking up in everyone's blood at once. This was a challenge, king to usurper, and by the sacred law of the pack no soldier could interfere. This had to be settled between the two of them alone in the old way, tooth and claw, to the death. Havard knew it. He looked at the ring of faces and understood that his soldiers wouldn't save him, that the law he'd hidden behind for 8 months had turned against him. His lip curled. You can barely stand, old king. Look at you, a skeleton. You think starving in my shed made you stronger. He began to shift, his body swelling, fur bristling, until a great tawny wolf stood in his place, half again the size of the wasted black one across from him. I'll finish what the silver started. The 2 wolves circled. The whole courtyard held its breath. Elsa pressed Tobin's face into her shoulder, but the boy squirmed to see. Havard lunged first. He was bigger, faster, well-fed and strong, and he hit Rurik like a battering ram and drove him back across the stones. Jaws snapped. Blood flew. Rurik went down under the tawny wolf's weight, and a cry went up from the crowd. Havard's teeth found the black wolf's shoulder and clamped down, and Rurik howled in pain. He was losing. The months of starvation had done exactly what Havard wanted. The true king was too weak. He twisted and clawed, but he could not throw off the bigger wolf, and slowly Havard bore him down against the cold stones, jaws working toward his throat. The loyal wolves at the edge of the yard shifted and whined, but not one of them broke the circle, because the law was the law, and the law said no one could help him now. And then a small voice rang out across the whole silent, bloody courtyard. Get up, you can do it. It was Tobin. He'd wriggled halfway out of his mother's arms, and he was shouting at the black wolf the way he might cheer a friend with his whole 3-year-old heart. You can do it. Get up. And the great black wolf heard him. Something changed in those green eyes. Rurik twisted under Havard's weight, found some last hidden well of strength, some fire that starvation hadn't reached, and he wrenched free. He came up off the stones snarling, and this time when Havard lunged, Rurik was ready. He ducked the charge, spun, and buried his teeth in the tawny wolf's throat. Havard screamed. He thrashed and clawed, but Rurik held on, and slowly, terribly, he bore the bigger wolf down onto the stones. The usurper's struggles grew weaker. His paws scrabbled once, twice, and went still, and then it was over. Rurik released him and stepped back, and Havard Crane lay dead in the center of the courtyard he had stolen. For a long moment nobody moved. Then, one by one, the wolves of the pack lowered their heads. The soldiers dropped their blades. And across the whole of Thornwatch Keep, the old law settled back into place, and the true king was king again. Rurik shifted back into the shape of a man, bleeding, exhausted, but standing. He didn't go to the throne. He didn't raise his fist to the crowd. He walked, slow and limping, straight across the courtyard to a poor scullery maid and her 3-year-old son. The whole keep watched, silent, not understanding. Rurik Vane, Alpha King of Thornwatch, got down on one knee in front of Tobin. He was so tall that even kneeling, he looked the boy nearly in the eye. "You brought me water," Rurik said, "when kings and soldiers and every grown man in this place looked away. You brought me bread when I was nothing." He looked up at Elsa, and his eyes were wet. "And your mother broke my chains when she knew what it might cost her. Do you know what that means, little one?" Tobin shook his head solemnly. "It means," Rurik said, "that when everyone else forgot how to be brave, a poor maid's son remembered. And that is worth more than any crown." He rose and turned to face the pack, one hand resting on Tobin's small shoulder, the other reaching out to Elsa, and that right there was the moment that left every soul in Thornwatch speechless. The king they'd all buried alive. The usurper they'd all feared, dead on the stones. And their rightful ruler, honoring a scrubbing woman and her toddler in front of the whole clan. "This woman and her son," Rurik called out, "risked their lives for a stranger in chains. Not for gold, not for a title, for nothing but mercy. Remember it, because that is the only law worth keeping. Look after the ones the world looks past, and you will never lose your way." The days after were strange and slow, the way the world always is after a storm finally breaks. They buried the old stable master with the honors of a lord, because in the end he'd been braver than any of them. Havard's soldiers were sent from the keep. The ones who begged forgiveness were allowed to go home to their families. The ones who didn't were sent farther. Rurik was not a cruel man, but he was not a foolish one either. Elsa went back to work the first morning after, out of habit more than anything, on her knees on the great hall floor with her scrub brush. She didn't know how to be anything else. That was when Rurik found her. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked up, flustered, wiping her hands. "The floor, your grace, it needs doing." He crouched down in front of her, this great king, right there on the wet stones, and gently took the brush out of her hand and set it aside. "You will never scrub another floor in this keep," he said, "unless it's one you choose to. You and Tobin have a home here for as long as you live. Not off the kitchen, not in the cold, a real one." He smiled, the same smile he'd only ever given the boy. "I owe you my life. But that's not why I'd want you here anyway. This keep forgot how to be kind. You and your son reminded it. I need people around me who remember." Elsa's eyes filled. She thought of all the years of being invisible, of being girl, of teaching herself that surviving was the most she could hope for. And she thought of the frost-bright morning she'd turned around and found her son gone, and how that one terrible moment had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to them. "Why did you kneel to him?" she asked softly. "In front of everyone, to a poor woman's child." Rurik was quiet a moment. "When I was chained in that shed," he said, "I stopped believing there was any good left in the world. Every day someone walked past that door. Guards, servants, people I'd once ruled fairly. And every one of them looked away. I understood it. Fear is a strong thing, but I stopped believing anyone would ever choose to see me again." He looked toward the doorway where Tobin was chasing a keep dog in circles, shrieking with laughter. And then a 3-year-old boy who owed me nothing, who had every reason to be afraid, walked straight through that door and gave me his water. He didn't look away. He couldn't even understand why he should. Rurik's voice went rough. "A grown pack forgot its honor. A child remembered it for us. How could I not kneel to that?" Tobin grew up in Thornwatch Keep after that, and he grew up strange for a king's ward. He never learned to look away from a person in trouble, because nobody ever taught him he should. He'd give his bread to a beggar at the gate and his cloak to a shivering stranger, and Rurik never once scolded him for it. The old king would just watch the boy and smile that private smile, and sometimes his eyes would go far away, back to a cold shed and a cup of water held up by two small hands. Elsa lived to see her son grown tall and good and loved by the whole clan. And on the day she finally told him the full story, how she'd nearly run, how every sensible bone in her body had screamed at her to grab him and forget that chained man forever, Tobin just shrugged and said, "But he was thirsty, Mama, and nobody gave him water." As if it were the simplest thing in the world, and maybe it was. Maybe that was the whole of it. In a keep full of grown men and warriors and wolves, in a place ruled by fear where everyone had learned that safety meant keeping your eyes on the ground, the bravest thing anyone did was done by a boy too young to know he was supposed to be afraid. He saw a suffering man where everyone else saw only danger. He gave what little he had. And that one small act of mercy, from the poorest child in the whole clan, brought down a usurper, restored a king, and left every proud wolf in Thornwatch remembering, for the rest of their lives, that they'd been taught what honor was by a scullery maid's toddler and a crust of bread.